All right. Well, welcome back. Glad to see you all again on this Wednesday night. We are coming up on kind of the end of our series. There's 3 classes left. Slugging through it. Hopefully you found it to be beneficial. But we have another lesson out of the book of James tonight. So 2 years ago, in November of 2020, we were doing a Wednesday night series on overcoming, and it was somebody different every week, various teachers kind of class. And I happened to be teaching the Wednesday night class the Wednesday before the presidential election. And my topic that night was overcoming worry, which at the time I thought was kind of funny, we had an election coming up. And tonight, my lesson, being the Wednesday after the midterm election, is on planning for the future. So irony is no longer ironic when it becomes a pattern, but here we are. But tonight we're talking about boasting about tomorrow, which kind of entails James's thoughts on planning for the future and some good ways and some bad ways in which we can plan for the future. But we all love making plans. Some more than others, but we all like to make plans. And nobody appreciates a well-constructed plan more than I do. Growing up, we had a little bit of a joke in our house, and if you know my dad, if you know him well, you'll find this humorous. But growing up, anytime we ever went on a vacation, he would put together these incredibly elaborate spreadsheets over where we were going, when we were going to be leaving, what we were going to eat, how much it was going to cost, and he would plan it all out. And it was very elaborate, color-coded, the whole 9 yards. And every detail was accounted for. Now, they say, the old saying goes, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And in some ways, the apple never even falls off the tree. Because guess who thoroughly enjoys making elaborate spreadsheets when his family goes on vacation? That would be me. Much to my wife's chagrin. But some of us may not enjoy it as much as others, but we all plan for the future and we make plans. There's a lot of pivotal moments in our lives where we're all required to make certain amounts of plans. Think back when you were a little bit younger and you were planning on going to college or where you were going to go to college, trying to figure out what you wanted to do for a career. And think back and remember, being in that process of nothing in the world really mattered a whole lot except I have to figure out where I want to go to college. And you're looking at all these different colleges, and you're finally basing a decision about where you want to go to college based upon the major that they have. You're really excited about the program they have. And then you get there, and then what do? You change your major 3 or 4 times because that's just the way it works. And honestly, in a lot of ways, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. But we all make plans for what our family's going to be like, who we're going to marry, those kinds of things. And how many of us made plans when it comes to marriage and family, and those plans turned out exactly as you planned them to be? I think we can all say that we've all been surprised in certain ways. All positive surprises, Kendra. But we all make plans for retirement, for our financial future. How many people in here within the last 3 days have checked to see how much money you have in your 401k? We all check those things and we plan for the future. Because planning is an important part of life, of human life. And it's important. It helps us set goals. It helps us set priorities. Helps us achieve a purpose. Clarifies our path for the journey. Promotes efficiency. Helps us have a sense of what's to come. But ultimately, planning helps us feel, in some ways, that we are in control of what's to come. And I think that's oftentimes where things get a little complicated for us. So tonight we're talking out of James chapter 4. We're going to start in verse 13. And this is our entire text tonight, and I'm just going to go ahead and read it for us. It says, "Now listen, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money.' Why you do not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, 'If it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that.' As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." And this passage that James is giving us is kind of a representation of the presumptuous nature of men and the conceit that comes along with that. If I were to kind of give a modern day update to this, it may sound a little something like this. Today or tomorrow, of course, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be in great health. No emergency is going to come up. I'm not going to get sick. No sudden death is going to claim the life of someone I care about. We may go into the city. The weather's going to be great. Transportation will be available. We'll meet up somewhere. We'll grab lunch. There won't be any accidents. We'll arrive exactly as Google Maps planned it out for us. Spend a year there. Lodging will be available. It'll be affordable. No problems. No riots will break out. No pandemic will occur. No war will break out. No disastrous fire will hinder us. No hurricane will sweep us away. No thieves or robbers will harm us. We'll carry on business. Goods will be available of any kind, quality, and price that we want. There will be no shortages, no damaged freight, no ruined merchandise, no city regulation, no competition, no shortage of labor will get in our way. We can even get it same-day delivery, as the website guarantees. And money, of course, we'll make lots of it. Buyers will want our products, and they'll be plentiful. They will have the money, and they'll wish to purchase our goods, and they'll want to purchase them at a price substantially higher than what we paid. Profits will roll in. So tonight, the thought is, what should be thought of such godless planning, or what James is calling arrogant schemes? Is the takeaway from this that planning and making plans is wrong? I don't think that's what James is saying. In fact, making plans or setting goals is an important part, as we mentioned earlier, of human life. And we often see examples, especially Paul, but you can find other examples. Paul was adamant about making plans about his travels, where he was going, his missionary journeys. So the error is not in planning for the future, but the error is failing to consider God as part of those plans. And as James points out, there is a right and there is a wrong way to go about this. So let's talk about the right way to plan for just a moment. As James points out, we have to submit our plans to God's will. And he mentions in verse 15 by saying, if it is the Lord's will. And we should recognize, or rather, we should make those plans for ourselves within the boundaries of the limited things we have control over, while recognizing and accepting that God may have other plans in store for us. Now, as I was digging through some of this, a verse kind of came to me in Proverbs. That's going to be kind of a running theme tonight. But Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9 says, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. The idea being that we have ideas about where we're going, but the Lord provides us with a pathway to get there. And sometimes that pathway doesn't always end up where we think it will. So James is telling us to make our plans contingent on if it is the Lord's will. And I always appreciate when I hear people get up here in the public assembly, or even when we're in smaller groups, and they pray and they say things like, Lord willing, and if the Lord wills. And this is something that Paul did regularly when he would communicate with in his communications. In Acts chapter 18, verse 20, he's talking to some brethren, and he says, when they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined, but as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. Then he set sail for Ephesus. And then again in his writing to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 6, he says, perhaps I will stay with you for a while, or even spend the winter, so that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now and make only a passing visit. I hope to spend time with you if the Lord permits. So on two occasions, this is Paul saying, if it is God's will, and on another occasion, he said, if the Lord permits. So the idea behind this is it assumes our faith in a couple things when we pray this way or when we plan this way. The first thing is that it assumes our faith that God does have a will for us, even in mundane matters. We often think that, well, this is mundane, it's irrelevant, God doesn't care. But I think through our studies through the Bible, we know that that's not necessarily true. And also saying this assumes our faith that God can and at times does intervene in our lives to carry out his will. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about recognizing and accepting that he may have plans for us. We have to recognize that he does in fact have a will for us and accept when he does intervene to carry out that will. And it's really easy to talk about that. It's really easy to say, but it's often difficult to put that into daily practice. And this is one of those topics that when you're talking with, the intellectuals of the world, you start to see some debate about if this is true, then I don't have free will. And you hear people argue that if this is true, that if God has a will for me and he's actively intervening to fulfill that will, then my will is not my own. Therefore, I must not have free will. And kind of to head that off, I think, at least from my perspective, when you're talking about things like this, it's difficult to fully understand and grasp the full concept of how God intervenes in our life. So there's that. But to some degree, I can understand the logic behind somebody thinking that way. If God's providence is going to lead me to something, then my decision to get there is not my own. But I think that there's some obvious flaws with that logic if you kind of follow that logic through. At its core, free will is the idea that we have the capacity to choose between different courses of action unimpeded or without restraint at my sole discretion. I get to choose. Now, the problem with that logic is free will doesn't necessarily give us the freedom to determine the outcome. So you think about that for a minute. If I have free will, I have the ability to choose. I don't have the ability to choose how the outcome turns out. Free will gives us the freedom to make choices. It gives us the ability to consider all the variables we are aware of at any given moment and make a decision. God actively working in our lives is one of those variables, and maybe the only variable, the most important variable. Ultimately, free will doesn't give us the option of choosing our own outcomes, but rather it gives us the opportunity to freely decide how we're going to react or how we're going to respond to God's will actively working in our lives. And I was trying to come up with a good example of this, and I kept coming back to Mary. And this is a picture I found. I'm sure it looked just like this. But think about the story of Mary for a moment. So Mary, minding her own business one day, when Gabriel, the angel of the Lord, comes to her and delivers the single biggest piece of breaking news that anybody's ever received. And, you think about that story and try to put yourself in the mindset of the things that she was probably thinking at that time. Now, did God come to her and ask Mary if she was willing to volunteer for this job? Did he ask her if she was up for the challenge? If this is something she was going to be comfortable with? Did he say, hey, I have this really, really big idea. Do you have any feedback? Any thoughts about this? No, the angel came to her and said, this is what's going to happen. You will have a child, and his name will be Jesus. Now, you can probably think, or I would imagine, that Mary, at this point in her life, probably had some big plans for her life in mind. I don't know, but I would imagine she probably did. I would think that she probably had some plans for the future. I mean, she was betrothed to Joseph at this time, and I'm not about to put myself in the mindset of a young woman who's about to get married and the things that she's thinking of and going through, but I would imagine she was having some similar thoughts. Now, when she was presented with the single biggest piece of life-altering news that anyone has ever received, how did she respond? Well, the first thing she did is she had some questions, rightfully so. I think there were some logistical matters that she was understandably curious about. But in Luke chapter 1, verse 38, this is her response. She says, I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. That's a pretty powerhouse response, considering the weight of what she just learned. Is that how we would respond? Think about your own lives. Is that how we respond when things come up and we feel like God's pulling us in a certain direction? Is that how we respond to that situation? I've stressed much more over significantly less in my life. But again, it's not wrong to make plans, but like Mary, we have to be willing to accept and acknowledge that God may have other plans for us. And this kind of takes us to the alternative, the wrong way, which is we can ignore God's will in our life. And James kind of goes through a little bit of a checklist here over reasons why doing this is foolish. You read in James chapter 4, verse 13, it says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city, Spend a year there, carry on business, make money. I think that's another way of coming to the conclusion that life is complex. So many decisions to make, so many mistakes to be made. Now, Jordan last week talked a little bit in his lesson about, he mentioned a study, and I didn't coordinate this, but as he was talking about this study he came across, I was sitting there thinking, I'm about to talk about this next week. But it was a study about decision making, and the study that he mentioned was basically said, on average, a human adult makes 122 informed decisions every single day. Now, this isn't talking about the kind of unintended decisions, the things we're not really thinking about. The things we're consciously thinking about and we have to make an informed decision about. We do that about 122 times a day. Now, of those 122 decisions, we change our minds on average of twice. So, moral of the story is there's very little that we're absolutely certain about because life is complex. And refusing to seek God's will for us in the moments where crucial decisions need to be made only increases our chances of devastation. Now, ignoring God's will is foolish also because life is uncertain. No one has a guarantee of tomorrow, whether or not we will even have a tomorrow, or what will happen in that tomorrow. We see commercials on TV talking about products that we're trying to be sold on that guarantee a certain result or guarantee a certain lifespan. There's a famous court case from 1929, Hawkins v. McGee, that we had to study when I was in law school. And the case involved a young man who was probably 18, 19 years old, and when he was a younger boy, he had been in an accident. I think it had to do with like electrical wiring incident or something, but he had a pretty significant amount of scarring on his hand. So he had a lot of scar tissue on the palm of his hand. And he went to go see a doctor to see what could be done about the scarring on his hand. And the doctor made him a guarantee. And the doctor made him a guarantee that he would make the hand 100% good again. So the doctor initiated a procedure, and he did a skin graft, taking skin from the young man's chest and put it onto his hand. The surgery was done. Everything seemed to go well. Everything looked pretty good. But it was a couple weeks after the surgery took place that he began noticing that hair was growing on the palm of his hand. And this is referred to as the hairy hand case. And he sued the doctor, and you kind of think that through. You take skin tissue, skin particles from the chest that grows hair and put on the palm. You're going to have those pores are going to come along with it, and you're going to start growing hair in your hand. And he sued the doctor for breach of contract for failure to deliver on that guarantee. And he made a lot of money on that. And this case is the reason why every time you go to the doctor, you have to fill out 30 pages worth of paperwork. But only God can bring about what he wills for the future without fail. There are no guarantees in this world. Life is not a product that can be purchased with certain guarantees. And since this is true, we should certainly desire to make plans in keeping with God's will. Ignoring God's will is foolish because life is frail. James chapter 4, verse 14 says, "Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Some of your versions may call it a vapor, but it talks about a mist or a vapor. And I'm a literal guy, so when I see this, I'm literally thinking about, well, what is mist? What is vapor? How significant is it? How substantial is it? Well, mist is obviously a large collection of tiny little droplets of water, particles of water. And mist, generally speaking, can be defined as a liquid droplet 20 microns in diameter. And you're probably thinking, oh, microns. Yeah, I'm familiar with those. But a micron is a unit of length equal to 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So you have your meters, you have your centimeters, millimeters, and you have your micrometers or microns. Now, for comparison, a human hair is about 70 microns. A piece of paper laying flat is about 100 microns. So a droplet of mist is 20 microns. In other words, it's incredibly insignificant. It's frail. And you think about, the things that we can, the things that happen in our life and how quickly we can succumb to sickness or be involved in an accident. And it just illustrates how frail and insignificant we are, much like that mist or that vapor. And it's foolish to think that we have the strength to overcome that or to will it into existence, our own plans. And the last thing here is that ignoring God's will is foolish because life is brief. It appears for a little time and then vanishes. Now, anytime I've ever thought about this verse or read this verse, a particular image would come to mind, and it would look a little bit something like this. And I don't know, all you science people, you may say that that's smoke, that's not mist or vapor, but roll with me here. But anytime I've ever thought about this verse, I always think about that moment that a candle gets blown out, and you have this smoke trail. And it's always different, depending on the temperature in the room or depending on how, the air is moving in the air. You have this trail, and it's always kind of moving in its own unique way, kind of like we're all unique in our own way. But there's that moment 4 or 5 seconds after that candle gets blown out where the wick cools just to the right temperature where that smoke trail just vanishes. And that's what I think of when I read this verse. And it says that our life appears for a short time and then it's gone. Because no matter what kind of candle it is, it always disappears and just vanishes. And this is something you read back, through the book of Job, and he kind of had similar sentiments as he was going through his struggles. But since life is so short, it's important that we do God's will and not our own. 1 John chapter 2, verse 17 says, "The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." Moving on to James chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, "As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them." In other words, to plan without considering God's will is an attempt to place ourselves higher than Him. It's an attempt to convince ourselves that we are the ones in control. And there's not much more, as far as arrogance is concerned, that I can think of that would be more arrogant than that. And then it goes on to say that to plan this way is sin. And we talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago in the lesson that I was doing about having a dead faith, and that there are different types of faith we can have. And a dead faith is a faith that knows the good it ought to do, but it doesn't do it. It understands, in theory, what God's will is for us, but it chooses not to go down that path. It is sin because it involves arrogance and boasting, which is evil. And it is sin because as Christians, we know better. We know the good we ought to do, but we don't do it. So the big question with all of this is, well, how do you even do this? That's kind of the question I kept coming to. Well, how, if we're talking about following God's will, how do I do that? How do I discern what God wants for me in my life? Is this something that's even possible? And in the New Testament, it talks a little bit about this as being something that is possible for us. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 17, it's a little small up there, but it says, Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. Colossians 1:9 says, For this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of His will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. And then Romans 12, chapter 2 says, Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So just looking at this collection of verses, I think we can gather that there is a way to discern what God's will is for us. And obviously the Spirit helps us with that. But much of this relates to the parts of God's will that is actually discernible. I'm of the belief that there are parts of God's will that is not discernible, but there are parts that are discernible. And the parts that are discernible usually come from wisdom that we draw from the Bible. Psalms 119, verse 105 says, Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. God's will sheds light on what that will is, and it's our job to follow that path. But usually when we're talking about discerning, God's will for us, and we're talking about, getting that wisdom from the Bible, it kind of usually boils down to things that are, we're making decisions between things that are right and wrong. We know, when we know God's revealed will through the study of His Word, we can act and we can plan according to that will. If I'm in a situation where I'm in a disagreement with somebody, and I have two options. I can choose to go to that person and work it out, or I can choose to go behind their back and spread false rumors in retaliation. Now, we know the good and the wrong in this particular scenario, and we know that because we've read God's Word and we know what He has to say about that. We can discern God's will for us in that moment through His teachings. And God's will, as expressed through His Word, tells us what the good option in this particular scenario is. But we all know that in any single decision usually is not boiled down to such simple terms. There's this idea in the world of psychology known as the paradox of choice. And it's the idea that when you have many options to choose from, rather than making people happy and ensuring that they're going to get what they're looking for, it can cause stress, create problems in decision making, because they're overwhelmed, and it leads to unhappiness. Just for example, you go to a restaurant and the menu is 15 pages long. I don't know about you, but that stresses me out. Cheesecake Factory is the prime and absolute worst example. When your menu is a spiral-bound notebook, it's too long. But you go to the store and you want some milk, and you're at the milk aisle and you're looking at all the options. You have whole milk, 2%, low-fat, skim, raw, organic, lactose-free, almond, oat, cashew, soy, rice, coconut, and that's just the ones I got off the Google search. There's a lot of options. And I have one more example, but I do want to point out that I recognize that all my examples here are about food. You draw your own conclusions as to why that is. But my last example here is, I don't know about you guys, but me and my family love to go to Sonic to get drinks. They have a lot of different options there. And if you're wondering, Joel, how many options do they have? Well, I'm happy to tell you. There are 1,063,953 different drink combinations at Sonic. That's a lot. And I will say, yes, in my younger days, I did think it was fun to test the limits on those combinations. And yes, they will sell you an orange chocolate Sprite if you ask for one. And yes, it does taste like an orange Tootsie Pop, bringing us back to our lesson 2 weeks ago. We're coming full circle. We're making some headway. But having options presents us with a lot of stress. And that stress is compounded when we find ourselves not knowing what God wants for us in our lives. Because sometimes it's incredibly difficult to know what God wants for us in His will. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 says, "Knock and the door will be open to you." In other words, the door won't open unless you knock. But what happens when you knock on the wrong door? What happens when you don't know who's behind the door that you're knocking on? And that brings us back to James in chapter 4. Thinking that we are in control and boasting about it. And sometimes it's okay not to know what to do in any given moment, as long as we're making our plans, whatever we choose, despite our indecisiveness, subject to God's will, even if we don't know what that is. But how do we submit to God's will when we don't know what it is, when it's not readily discernible? We mentioned the parts of God's will that are discernible, usually involving kind of distinguishing between what's right and what's wrong. But what about when we're trying to decide between what's good and what's better? Or when we're trying to decide between what's bad and what's less bad? After I graduated law school, I had to take this little test called the bar exam. And it is by far the hardest test I've ever had to take. And I have made a commitment and a promise to myself that I will never take a test ever again. Even those pop-up online quizzes, won't do it. And in fact, a couple of months ago, I don't remember when this was, when Bible Bowl took place and the kids went to Bandina for Bible Bowl. My son, who's 9, this was the first year that he could go, and so I took him, I went along for the ride, and I had grown up going to Bandina, so I thought it'd be fun to go back. But I wasn't taking the test, I was just there and helping in any way I could. But I was in the room whenever the kids, they're all sitting there and they're sitting at the tables and they're all spaced out evenly and they all have their tests in front of them, they got their pencils sitting there, and the proctor said, "You may now begin." And I'm not even kidding, my heart started pounding. I was like having like PTSD, and so I had to actually leave the room to go outside and grill some burgers. But anyway, that's a side story. But the bar exam, it's a 3-day exam. And one of those days, the second day, it consists of 200 multiple choice questions. And it's a 6-hour time frame to answer 200 multiple choice questions. It was a 3-hour block in the morning, 100 questions, 3-hour block in the afternoon, 100 questions. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, multiple choice, that's not too bad. That's not hard. But most of these questions consisted of either between a half page or a full page of prompt. So you read through this whole, prompt, full page long, and then you get to the questions, which themselves were, a paragraph long or so. But the question was always, choose the best answer. Simple enough. 1 in 4 shot of getting it right. Can't be that bad. But the problem is the choices, on some occasions, all 4 of them were correct. So you're having to choose what's the best option amongst all the options that are correct. But more often than that, which was even harder, is sometimes all the options were completely wrong. And it was your job to figure out or decide which one is the best answer out of everything that was wrong. And life feels like that sometimes, does it not? All the answers are wrong, and it's on us to choose which is less wrong. And this is incredibly difficult to do because often we don't know whether or not we've made the right decision until a long time later, sometimes maybe years later. And we sometimes believe that we've made that choice at the time in line with God's will, and then later on discover that we were in error. And I don't know about you, but in my life, I've often had this kind of understanding, maybe ever since I was a kid, this idea that God's will was this giant book. Not as big as the Cheesecake Factory menu, but a big book. And this big book that consisted of God's will had this long list of pivotal moments in my life. And then when I would come to one of those moments, his will would say, well, this is the right option for you, and these are the wrong options. And then it was up to me to try to figure out what was the right answer or the right option. If I choose wrong, then my decision is not in line with God's will. I tell myself that God's will has a specific plan for me, then it's up to me to make the right choice. And to some degree, there may be some truth to that, but I think when you think like that, we're giving ourselves way too much credit for the things that happen in our life. I think this is the idea that we start to drift into what James is talking about with arrogant schemes. We start to think that, well, I have more control over this than I really do. And the question that I come back to when I think of that is, are we that capable of subverting God's will? I think about the story of Jonah. God made his will very clear to Jonah about what he wanted Jonah to do. He wanted Jonah to go to Nineveh. Jonah did what? He did not go to Nineveh. He had other plans. He had the free will to decide whether or not he was going to go to Nineveh or not, but he made a decision to try to go against what God had told him. And, the story of Jonah is always fascinating because, there's this, he's out at sea, big storm, he goes overboard, giant fish. It's a very kind of insane story when you think about it. But did God's intervention in Jonah's story alter Jonah's free will? I don't think so. Jonah had the option. He had the ability to make the decisions about what he wanted to do. But I come back to the verse that I mentioned earlier, Proverbs 16, verse 9. In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. God's will is going to play out how God wants it to. It's our job to submit to it and to remain faithful. And sometimes I think our focus should be less on hoping we choose the right path and more on praying that God gives us the wisdom to recognize which doors we should be knocking on. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, starting in verse 6, it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Trying to discern God's will in our life is something that transcends our understanding. But through prayer, we can gain wisdom and peace that transcends that understanding. Now, I want to end with a little bit of a story. As you probably are aware, we recently went through a pretty extensive process to locate and find a new preacher. And Sean, I should have given you a heads up. I was going to tell a story about you. It's a good story, don't worry. But I was fortunate enough to be part of the search committee, and it was a very interesting experience. I'd never been involved in that before. But our prayer from the get-go for the entire process was that God would lead us to the right man and his family. And that's something we prayed about in our meetings. That's something I prayed about at home with my family. That's something, you heard people get up here and say, lead us to the right man and his family. And I remember having discussions with people at the time we're asking God to lead us to the right man and his family, but how will we know? And that's kind of an interesting question. How will we know? But in our worldly wisdom at that time, we started this process and we chose not to advertise for the position. And there were a lot of reasons for that, and there were several methods we could have chosen. I mean, there's a lot of job posting boards you can find that are specific to preachers in the Church of Christ community, through the Churches of Christ affiliated colleges and things like that. But we chose not to do that. We thought that we would have better luck finding the right candidate through word-of-mouth suggestions from the congregation and from people that we trusted. And through word-of-mouth suggestions, we gathered and compiled a very extensive list of a lot of potential candidates. Needless to say, we listened to quite a few sermons. But several months into the process, a name came forward, and one of the members here had given us the name of somebody who had been preaching for a long time, and we were told that he may be looking to make a change. And we listened to him, and it became very apparent quickly that he was a very good candidate. And we got a little bit excited about the possibility of what that might mean. So we reached out, and he expressed a shared interest, and there was even a little bit more excitement. But then a few weeks later, he called back and he withdrew his name from consideration due to some family reasons, very legitimate reasons. And we felt, or at least I felt, a little defeated by the process. I know the congregation here was anxious to see where that process would take us. And we kind of felt like at the time we needed to maybe start from scratch, do something different. But that particular event inspired us to take a little bit of a different approach in the process, and a door presented itself, and we decided to knock. You all remember Jeff Jenkins, who preached here several times. He is a longtime preacher, and he also happens to run a preaching institute called the Jenkins Institute that trains young preachers and has a lot of resources for preachers, and there's a shared kind of collective network amongst preachers, and he sends out a weekly newsletter to this network. So we decided to post an ad in his newsletter, and after some careful consideration, completely against what we had initially decided we were going to do. And that was posted, and within about 20 minutes, we got our first hit. And it was from this preacher who was from Texas, had spent some time in Tennessee, had 3 kids, and his name was Sean Montandon, who just so happened, at least in my mind, was a much more exciting candidate than we had ever found, even in the one in the first place. And this was prior to, we hadn't heard of Sean hadn't heard of us. It was kind of an interesting story, and I've shared this with Sean of how things work, and as they say, the rest is history. Now, is it God's will that brought Sean and his family here? I like to think so. We had prayed that God would lead us to the right man and his family. We just so happened to find an excellent man and a wonderful family, and we're so glad that you guys are here. James 1, chapter 17, and we've talked about it a few times in this class, says that every good and perfect gift is from above. Now, I don't want to get your head big here, Sean. I wouldn't say you're perfect by any means, but you and your family have definitely been a good gift to us here at Woodland Oaks. And I want to come back to Proverbs chapter 16, verse 9. And I want to read it one more time. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. God is in control. Relying on our own wisdom and making our plans will not result in the way we think it will. We must rely on God and submit to his good and perfect will. Let's pray and we'll wrap this up.